comprise no obligation whatever to the purported bank. Moreover, then, if the purported banking systems of the world indeed acted as beneficial interventionists, the payment of principal, which fulfills our obligations to each other, would be retired from circulation. From the mere fact that the purported banking systems which have been imposed upon the world in the false name of economy create money only when we assume promissory obligations to pay for property which is not provided by the purported banking system. From this fact itself, we understand that the purported debt and false idea of borrowing money into circulation comprise no debt to the purported banking system at all. For never do we borrow the property of a bank at all. On the contrary, according to the natural life cycle of promissory obligations, fulfillment of the obligation ceases any further existence of obligation. Payment of principal, therefore, is always only rightly retired from circulation. Paid principal is the possession of no one. Never is paid and thus fulfilled principal the rightful possession of anyone. For in fulfilling the obligation, the former obligation no longer represents anything. Thus the idea of debts to banks is wholly without basis. The idea of risked property justifying interest is wholly without basis, and therefore the laundering of principal into the ever unwarranted possession of the purported banking system, and the imposition of interest, only as if earned and possessed wealth were at stake, are purely crimes against us, imposed by a means which in turn happens furthermore to be terminal. To ever have just, sustainable economy, therefore, we must eradicate all the improprieties of what are merely and consistently imposed systems of exploitation. No intelligent nation in history has ever approved the purported principles of such a devastating, terminal system of exploitation, therefore, because it is impossible for that ever to be a fact. For a dollar, therefore, on the contrary, a mere publisher of mere evidence of our promissory obligations to each other may issue $100,000 into circulation as a falsified debt to the mere publisher. The real creditor, who provided the property for the mere evidence of the promissory obligation, is denied interest by the purported banking system, which itself only claims to be the creditor. Yet that pretended creditor gives up no property. It is merely and indisputably only a publisher of evidence of our promissory obligation to the system, which obligation is to pay and to retire principal from circulation, not to launder the principal into the unwarranted possession of the purported banking system, which only gave up $1 to publish the evidence of our promissory obligation. Thus, for our own ineptitude, for only $1, the purported banking system launders $100,000 into its possession, just in principle, and, entirely without warrant or justification, thereafter multiplies every initial falsified debt to the purported banking system into an inevitably terminal sum of debt. The very sole power and object of the purported banking system, therefore, is to dispossess us of several houses for every house we produce, until we inevitably succumb to a terminal sum of falsified artificial indebtedness which dispossesses us entirely. No intelligent, responsible person can turn away from these facts. for resolution of this issue is one of the most important matters of all history. Our understanding, and no less than our understanding, means that instead of stupidly suffering a further, wholly avoidable, global artificial monetary failure, finally humanity rises above a mere handful of the most unaccountable, mere thieves or embezzlers amongst us, to finally, by our prevailing need, number, and rectitude, establish a singular fact of actual economy. Indeed, rather than a design intended to serve us, the modern prototype of the so-called central banking system, the so-called Bank of England, was established by one of the most notorious and ruthless embezzlers of all time. As previous TNS radio programs have well taught, although payment or fulfillment of a promissory obligation should only rightly retire the principal from existence, because the obligation ceases when it is fulfilled, the first monumental crime of these purported banking systems, then, is that they launder all the principal which is ever created in this way into their unrightful possession. They never give up such lawful consideration. No such debt ever existed to the purported banking system. As I have taught for over 40 years, the second, even more monumental crime against us is that the further, ever unwarranted imposition of interest inherently and irreversibly multiplies this falsified indebtedness to a purported banking system into an inevitably terminal sum of artificial indebtedness, as a further injustice of interest comprises an implicit obligation for the unwitting subjects of any such system to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually reborrowing principal as a succeeding debt equal to the former sum of debt, which therefore is mathematically impossible to resolve. Thus, as the necessary reborrowing of interest paid out of the general circulation comprises new debt above the former sum of debt, perpetually increasing the sum of artificial, falsified debt so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of falsified debt, until, as indeed we now see everywhere around us, we accumulate a terminal sum of debt, in the default of which, finally, ever unrightful proprietorship of all property descends to the criminally imposed purported banking system, which indeed provides us no service whatever, and two, even produces nothing to acquire possession of all wealth. Whoever dreamed such a thing could be right was the enemy of all just mankind. These entities, which we so untowardly referred to as a purported banking system then, are merely modern implementations of the ancient ruse of the money changer, of an ancient riddle which only an inept and hapless mankind suffers so long as we forfeit representation, so long as we settle for less than absolute consensual representation, and so long as we ourselves perpetually know not what in fact serves us. We can only again suffer the final terminal dispossession of our own ineptitude then, for failing ourselves to master a fact of singular monetary solution in a fact of one and one only mathematically perfected economy. Thus, as I have taught for over 40 years, this 1968 proof of inevitable failure, the accurate and irrefutable projections of the provided models which embody this proof of inevitable failure, and the present experience of that failure altogether prove even terminal injustices and a perpetual denial of representation in a wholly avertible, unnecessary, and unnatural failure due entirely to the present purposed obfuscation of our currency, which purposed obfuscation was established not in accord with the concept of human rights and of representation of those rights, but instead in a purposed perpetual denial of representation for the naked, singular power and purpose of ever unassented exploitation. I have also taught for over 40 years how mathematically perfected economy and mathematically perfected economy alone solves all the categoric faults of the present perpetual lie of economy, a lie which only perpetuates a process of terminal failure. For over 40 years, then, this lie, because nothing can justify it against its certain exposure, has only been defended by evasion. Its perpetrators only perpetuate the terminal scheme, therefore, by concerted lies, which merely claim the opposite of what can be proven and has long been proven in a fact of one and one only mathematically perfected economy. Moreover, in examining the orchestrated lies, we can only discover the intended criminality of the scheme in the very design and recognizably necessary evasion of the lies themselves. Most remarkably, even in the midst of its inevitable end, ever without qualification, the very perpetrators, the very criminals against us, uniformly pretend they act on our behalf by pretending they can rescue an inevitably terminal process by preserving that terminal process. Thus they preserve the crime against you and ensure terminal failure. These are not matters of opinion, none of them. On the contrary, they are absolute mathematic facts. But thus the terminal consequence of this lie of economy is that the lie requires us to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually borrowing interest and principal back into circulation, with a necessary reborrowing of principal, persisting in prior sums of debt, and making it mathematically impossible to pay down any prior sum of debt, and with a necessary reborrowing of interest, perpetually increasing every prior sum of debt, so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt, until a terminal sum of debt exceeds a finite capacity to service debt and destroys creditworthiness to borrow further. These very conditions are our present conundrum, a most serious, irreversible, and terminal process which is only solved by a few elementary principles of what we call mathematically perfected economy. Given the perpetual denial of representation, then, which not only betrayed us to impose these crimes long ago, but which, by perpetual betrayal, persists in the crimes to this day, the present inherently terminal instrument of exploitation we merely call a banking system inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial, falsified indebtedness into terminal indebtedness. We, the people of the world, therefore, must understand all the improprieties of this criminal, destructive system, which in fact is mutually exclusive to the human concept and ideal of actual free enterprise. We must understand all the improprieties